Lock It Up podcast. Tune in to stay safe.
All right, you ready to dive into some code? Today we're tackling the programming languages that cybersecurity pros live and breathe.
It's like cracking the code, right? Figuring out what makes these languages tick and how they're used on both sides of the digital battleground.
Exactly. And we're zeroing in on Chapter 3 of the Lock It Up podcast, The Code Behind the Shield. They really went deep on this stuff, so we're going to break it down for you.
It's all about those key takeaways.
Absolutely. And they start with a language that's almost synonymous with cybersecurity these days. Python. It seems like it's everywhere. What makes it so dominant in this field?
Versatility. Think about it. Analyzing mountains of data for threats, automating complex security tasks, responding to incidents in real time. Python can handle it all.
I've also heard it's relatively easy to learn, even for beginners. Does that play a role in its popularity?
For sure. Python syntax, the way it's written, is very readable. But the real power comes from its ecosystem, a massive library of pre-built tools and modules designed specifically for security tasks.
So less time writing code from scratch, more time building those digital fortresses.
Exactly. And that applies whether you're on the attack or defense. The Lock It Up episode gave a great example with Nmap, that network scanning tool. A simple Python script can automate the whole process, spitting out insights in a flash.
So whether you're probing for weaknesses or shoring up defenses, Python's got you covered. Okay, so Python is the versatile all-rounder, but what about those systems running on Windows? That's a whole different animal, right?
Absolutely, and that's where PowerShell steps in. If Python's the Swiss Army knife, PowerShell's the key to the Windows kingdom.
The key. What makes it so powerful within the Windows environment?
Integration. PowerShell's deeply embedded into the Windows operating system, which gives you granular control over its inner workings.
Okay, so that sounds incredibly powerful, but also like it could be a double-edged sword. It's like having the master key, right? You can use it for good or for less noble purposes.
Exactly, and the Lock It Up episode really dug into that. On the defensive side, you've got blue teams using PowerShell for all sorts of system administration tasks, keeping those Windows machines in check.
Automation is key when you're managing a ton of devices. But I'm guessing that tight integration with Windows also makes PowerShell attractive to the bad guys.
Oh, absolutely. PowerShell can be used for everything from reconnaissance, mapping out a target network, to privilege escalation.
And that's where things get really scary, right? It's not just about getting in, it's about getting access to the really sensitive stuff.
Exactly. The podcast gave a chilling example with Active Directory attacks. That's like the central nervous system for a lot of organizations. If an attacker can manipulate Active Directory using PowerShell, well, they basically own the place.
Yikes. Okay, so PowerShell, powerful tool for good, but potentially devastating in the wrong hands. So we've covered Python, the versatile all-rounder, and PowerShell, the Windows wizard. What's next?
Let's go old school for a minute. Let's talk about Bash.
Bash. I thought we were talking about modern cybersecurity languages. Isn't Bash like that black screen with the flashing cursor?
Don't let the retro vibes fool you. Bash is still incredibly relevant, especially in the world of Linux and Unix systems, and those systems power a huge chunk of the internet.
Okay, so it's like the language closest to the machine itself.
Yeah.
Why is that so important for cybersecurity?
Control. Think of Bash as the conductor of an orchestra. Every command is an instruction that the system follows precisely. That level of control is essential for both building and breaking complex systems.
So it's all about automation at a very fundamental level. I can see how that would be appealing to both defenders and attackers. What are some examples of how the good guys use Bash?
Log analysis is a big one. Imagine sifting through mountains of data, trying to spot a tiny anomaly that could signal an attack. Bash can automate that, scanning for patterns and anomalies with incredible speed and accuracy.
And probably building custom security tools as well.
Absolutely. Bash scripts can be chained together to create really powerful tools tailored to a specific system or threat. But, as with every language we've talked about, that same power can be used for, shall we say, less noble purposes.
I bet the Lock It Up folks had some examples of how attackers can weaponize Bash.
Oh, yeah. They went there. Reconnaissance is a big one. Bash is like the ultimate scouting tool for attackers, allowing them to map out a target network, identify vulnerabilities, you name it.
It's a digital battlefield out there. Yeah. What else can attackers do with Bash?
Remember those attack chains we talked about earlier? Bash is often the glue that holds those together. Attackers can automate entire sequences of commands, which makes their attacks more efficient and harder to detect.
Not good. So we've talked about languages for general scripting, for Windows systems, for Linux systems.
Right.
But Data security, that's a whole other ballgame, right?
You're right. And that brings us to a language that's a little different from the others we've discussed. SQL, or Structured Query Language.
SQL. That's all about databases, right? I thought we were talking about programming languages.
True. SQL isn't your typical programming language. It's designed specifically for talking to databases. But in the world of cybersecurity, that makes it incredibly powerful. Because databases, well, they hold the keys to the kingdom.
They're treasure troves of valuable information, which makes them prime targets. I think I see where you're going with this.
Think about it. Customer details, financial records, proprietary secrets, they're all stored in databases. Knowing SQL is like having the ability to read and write in the language of those digital vaults.
So for the defenders, it's all about speaking the language of the vault, keeping the treasure safe.
Precisely. The LockItUP episode talked about security logs, which are basically records of every event that happens on a system. Knowing SQL lets security teams search, filter, and analyze those logs for suspicious activity.
So they're like digital detectives using SQL to track down clues in the data.
Yeah.
But the bad guys have figured out how to use SQL too, right?
Oh, yeah. And this is where things get really interesting. Ever heard of SQL injection attacks?
Maybe. It rings a bell. It has something to do with websites. Huh?
Exactly. Think about any website where you enter information, a login form, a search bar, whatever. Behind the scenes, there's probably a database storing that information, and SQL is what makes it all work. Now imagine an attacker figures out how to inject their own malicious SQL commands into that seemingly innocent web form. If the website isn't properly protected, those commands get executed by the database, and that's when things go sideways.
So instead of retrieving data, they're hijacking the entire database. It seems so simple, but the implications are huge.
It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, but it's still surprisingly effective.
So knowing even the basics of SQL is crucial for building a secure website or understanding how attackers might exploit it.
Absolutely, and that's what makes cybersecurity so fascinating. This constant back and forth between those building the defenses and those trying to break them, each side using these powerful languages to achieve their goals.
It really is a constant arms race.
Totally. And just like any good arms race, it's not just about the big guns.
What do you mean?
Well, we've talked about some heavy hitters, Python, PowerShell, Bash, SQL, but the LockItUP folks also highlighted a few more languages that you should have on your radar. They're not as widely used, but still pop up in security contexts.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What other languages should we be thinking about?
They specifically mention Java, Perl, and Ruby.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one, starting with Java. What's its claim to fame in cybersecurity world?
Think of Java as the language for building secure systems from the ground up. It's designed with security in mind, which makes it a popular choice for things like online banking systems, where a vulnerability could be disastrous.
Makes sense. You wouldn't build a bank vault out of, cardboard and duct tape.
Exactly. And it's not just about building secure systems. Java's also a really powerful tool for dissecting malware, figuring out how it works so you can neutralize it.
So from digital bank vaults to performing digital autopsies, that's quite a range. What about Perl? Where does it fit into all of this?
Perl's the ultimate text manipulator. If you need to sift through mountains of data, those massive security logs we talked about, Perl is your best friend.
The language for people who love data and aren't afraid to get their hands dirty.
100%. But it's not just about analysis. Perl's also a favorite for writing exploits, those bits of code that take advantage of vulnerabilities.
So it's another one of those languages that can be used for good or for not so good.
Yep. And finally, we have Ruby. This one's all about elegance and speed. It's known for being really readable and easy to use, which makes it great for building applications quickly. And of course, where you have applications, you need security.
Right. Doesn't matter how fast you can build it if it's got security holes the size of a truck.
Exactly. And that's why Ruby's also a popular choice for penetration testers. Those ethical hackers who try to break into systems to find weaknesses.
So even the good guys need to know how to think like the bad guys.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Metasploit, one of the most popular penetration testing frameworks, it's built on Ruby.
Wow, so Ruby's powering the tools that keep the internet safe. Who knew?
It just goes to show there's no one-size-fits-all language in cybersecurity. The best tool for the job always depends on what you're trying to do.
That makes sense. So for any aspiring cyber warriors out there, what's the key takeaway from all this?
Be curious. Never stop learning. And don't be afraid to get your hands dirty.
I love it. Knowledge is power.
Right. The more you understand how these languages work, the better equipped you'll be to build those digital fortresses. And maybe even break into a few, ethically, of course.
Ethically. Can't stress that enough.
Oh,
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Huge thank you for walking us through it.
anytime.
And for our listeners, if this episode has sparked your interest in the world of cybersecurity, don't stop here. Keep exploring, keep learning, and as always, stay curious.